Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We have an interesting topic and an interesting group of panelists and moderator as well. At the it's called Automation and Autonomy, Transportation Innovation, Air, Land, and Sea. And my name is Dennis Bruce. I am chair of the Transportation Technology Society of TAG, which is the Technology Association of Georgia. Today, we have a panel of four. We have a moderator and Mr. Todd Jones, who is a state representative here in Georgia. We have Lee Malloy. Lee is the head of R&D for Cox Automotive. We have Mr. Dan Plonk. Dan is the director of automation and innovation at Norfolk Southern. We have John Rogers, professor of aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech, and Jesse Kallman. And Jesse is the president of Airbus Aerial in North America. And just a few words here about TAG and about who we are. We are, as I mentioned, the Transportation Technology Society Transportation Technology Society, which is a focus group within TAG, which is the Technology Association of Georgia. And we are we try to highlight and promote innovative technology solutions to the transportation industry here and beyond. And we strive to connect the community and relationships across government, academic, and private sectors who have a passion to improve and innovate the way we transport people and products. So today's discussion, as I mentioned, will be led by Representative Jones. And we're going to talk about autonomy, as the title implies, and what our different panelists are seeing both within their countries and companies and industry about what is taking shape, what is coming up, what is here today, and what is being applied and what will be applied in terms of autonomy and automation in their companies and across the industry. So I'd just like to say a couple of words about our moderator, Mr. Todd Jones. He is a business executive and community leader. He is not a career politician, although that's what he is now, and to some extent anyway. Todd's business experience has been focused on triple bottom line companies that focus on social, environmental, and financial impacts, from changing K education worldwide to launching energy projects and developing world to deploying EHS software. Representative Jones, advocate, a very strong advocate for greater transportation options, such as autonomous vehicles, air taxis, and others. So he is a very knowledgeable person in both the public policy and the technology space, and in what's coming and what needs to happen to really bring some of these technologies online. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Representative Jones to lead our discussion. Todd, take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Let me go ahead and give you a rundown on how we're seeing the next hour, and then I'll jump into a couple of comments, hop into the roundtable. But ultimately, we have a group that's manageable enough that let's try to make this interactive. I know that's always tough on Zoom. We're all moving from one Zoom to a WebEx to a GoToWebinar and back to Zoom, it seems like nowadays. So let's try and get it where we're not multitasking or triple tasking, but rather just see how we can engage you. I want to say just a few comments to kick this off. It will not be a keynote speech, because I think a keynote speech over Zoom might be one of the most boring things, or possibly the cure to insomnia. So at the end of the day, I don't want to do that. We're going to go ahead and go into the roundtable, and then I'm going to be asking you, if you look on the bottom of your panel, you'll see, and many of you over the last 3 months have become very familiar with Zoom, you'll see the Q&A section. Please do us a favor in the Q&A, the chat, you name it, go ahead and send us a question. I'll do everything I can as the moderator to get that question asked and then hopefully answered by either one or more members of the panel. As was discussed in terms of the background, I think we have air covered, we have sea covered, we have trains covered, we have automobiles covered. So other than Steve Martin and John Candy, I think we got the entire movie here, and looking forward to it. But before we get going, I think it's important that we at least take a look at where we are in terms of autonomous. And I mean autonomous, and I stop right there. I didn't say autonomous vehicles, but rather just autonomy. I was heartened that when I came into the legislature in 2017, the first bill I did was co-author the autonomous vehicle bill with about 4 other of my colleagues. And I could not have been happier to make that the first bill that I did, because I'm a firm believer that no matter what path we take from a transportation standpoint, with all due respect to our construction industry, we cannot right away ourselves out of our transportation challenges here in Georgia, and we can't pave ourselves out of our right-of-way challenges here in Georgia in traffic. So we ultimately need to be looking at how can autonomous be part of the portfolio. No different than many of you looking at your 401ks. You got a little blue chip, you got a little growth, you got a little international. Well, here, where does autonomy play and how does it play? How does the air play in terms of, I don't see a lot of traffic up there, like to see more coming out of Hartsfield, but that's another discussion right now. But ultimately, how can we see those lanes? And I think it's important. The latest data, when you take a look at whether or not those, I'll just say normal citizen is willing to accept autonomy, unfortunately, it's a low percentage. If you look at it, it's about 1 in 5. And I know Lee's going to hit on this a little bit, so I don't want to take any of her thunder, but just think about that for a second. This is a group of technology execs, like technology directors. So my hunch is it's not 1 in 5 who believe autonomy is truly a way forward by 2030. My hunch is this group's probably more 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5. But if we just look at the population as a whole, it's only about 1 out of 5. And of those 4, 2 out of those 4 are probably in the maybe category, and 2 are in the not going to happen category. So how can we work with them? And again, I'm going to let Lee go ahead and handle most of the detail on that, but I think that's a challenge, which leads me to when we think about how we need to bring autonomy into Georgia. We know that Dallas and Los Angeles have announced air taxi service by 2023 in partnership with Uber. What can we do to beat that? What can we do to do that by 2021? What can we do to have more automobiles on our roads and on our streets and ultimately on our federal highways? And we'll get into a little bit about that in terms of how we're being, let's just say, given the Heisman by Congress in terms of putting them onto our federal highways. But we need to be able to do that because so many people are basically equating autonomy in 2020 the same way that President Kennedy equated the moonshot in the 1960s. But I want to give you another metaphor to be thinking about, and that's the interstate system. If you're thinking and you're looking to be a little bit geeky tonight and you're looking, what should I be looking at other than the 14 Netflix movies I've been watching the last 3 months while I've been shelter in place, do yourself a small favor and really Google and research how the interstate system came in. We know it obviously through Dwight Eisenhower and what he learned in WW2 from basically what Germany was doing, what Austria was doing in terms of the Autobahn. And he saw an interstate highway system as something that was an imperative from a defense system and also from an economic driver. Believe it or not, just like autonomy, it was not wildly accepted. There were so many states that argued that transportation was a state responsibility and not something the federal government should be getting its toes into. But ultimately, through a lot of politics and a lot of policy wrangling, and I'm sure some twisted arms, he was able to get that across the line. And we know the interstate system as it is because of Dwight Eisenhower's leadership and also because of Congress's ability to basically look beyond where they were in the 1950s and where they could be by the year 2000. Can you imagine what our economy would look like if we didn't have 95, 85, 75, 20, 70, 80, and 90, what it would look like without 10 and 5? I think things like that, we need to be able to craft that type of vision for that 4 out of 5 who right now are doubting it and say, we are going to put something together that has safety in mind, that basically has the ability, though, to leverage technology to be able to expand economic opportunities. Which the last comment I will make is this. Some will argue that we're already in the 4th industrial revolution. Others will argue we're just entering the 4th industrial revolution. I would say we definitely are in the precursors of it. But I think if anything, COVID has shown us, we're actually getting into it faster than we thought. And we saw that with 3D printing. I think we need to be embracing 3D printing and additive manufacturing along with autonomy. And I think as we go through what the consumer wants in the 2020s, they want personalization. We've seen that with the millennials. We've seen that with the Gen Zs. And I think through 3D printing, we're going to get economies of scale. We're going to be able to get manufacturing here in the United States. But ultimately, I hope that 3D printing combined with autonomy is going to be able to provide people with truly a personalized automobile or a personalized air taxi. And I think that's something that as we look and we see out into the future, may that be in 2025 or 2030, what can we be doing as business leaders and what can we be doing as community leaders to basically paint a picture where we can go, where our economy can be, how can we restructure our workforce, retrain our workforce, and really look at this as the launching point so that we get to 2030, we look back at 2020 and say, I can't believe that's where we were. Well, think about that. In 1970, we had hit the moon by 1969. By 1960, Eisenhower had in fact gotten the interstate system through. Let's be the ones that carry that vision here in Georgia. I think we have the opportunity to do it. I think we're going to get more embrace because of what people saw during COVID. And I think people are looking for, hey, where can the economy go? What can the fourth industrial revolution do for Georgia, for our workforce, and for our business? So hopefully those are things that you can be thinking about inside of this roundtable. We're going to go ahead and move to the roundtable now, if that's okay, because I think people don't want to necessarily hear me and dialogue, but rather want to hear from the experts and definitely get a good sense of where they're going. And I want to, again, stress to you, please do everything that you can to be able to provide to us some questions vis-a-vis the Q&A or the chat function. So because Lee has her voted today sticker on, she goes first. So we want to applaud Lee for that. But I do have two questions. I'm going to go ahead and hit one first for you, Lee, if that's okay. But love to get from you, which is kind of integrated into what my opening comments were. What do you see as the impact of COVID-19 on the autonomous vehicle market and its development? Lee, you're on mute.
Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Great question, Representative Jones. So I think it's a combination of tailwinds and headwinds, frankly, when you think about the COVID impact. And, you know, clearly, I think the biggest headwinds are this reduction in R&D spend. And you see that across the ecosystem and across all of these verticals, right? Whether it's terrestrial, aerial, probably rail as well, right? There's just less capital available for expenditure in some of these newer areas. So I think that tightening of R&D spend is certainly going to have an impact on AV in the short term, but I do see a positive long-term trajectory. And secondarily, I think the headwinds are also kind of associated with the cost of AV technology overall, right? If we want to democratize how people and things get around, you know, the LiDAR has kind of been the great example of how it's just not scalable to really bring an autonomous vehicle to market anytime soon for personal ownership. So I think, you know, cost is certainly a big barrier, but we've also seen, you know, some good tailwinds too, in the sense that as people are sheltering in place, right, they're looking to autonomous solutions to satisfy last mile delivery of goods. This creates opportunities for, you know, humanless contact for grocery delivery or medicine. You know, neuro is one such example in California that's made some great headlines. And then there's some kind of creepy headlines too, right? The ability for drones to provide surveillance or understand what's happening beyond curfews, or thermal sensors for temperatures, or loudspeakers, or floodlights to monitor crowds. But the backdrop is that I think COVID in general has presented headwinds and tailwinds for AVs, but certainly in the aerial space, you know, you're seeing some really unique use cases where drones are being deployed. And even in the terrestrial space, you know, these small last mile, low speed delivery vehicles are making an entry.
All right, well, thanks a lot. Real quick, before we get going, has John joined us from Georgia Tech yet? Because I had a follow-up question I wanted to get from the professor out of Georgia Tech regarding Lee's comment regarding headwinds and tailwinds. John, are you on yet?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Great. So John, you just heard Lee's comments regarding headwinds and tailwinds. And what are you seeing as the biggest technological challenges we are currently facing as we increase automation to achieve that within transportation?
Well, I second everything Lee said, and particularly I think it's highlighted to folks the value of scalable, very targeted transportation paradigms that only autonomous solutions can bring us. You know, if we want to increase, the food deliveries and the targeted small package deliveries that we provide to people, that's really only going to scale if we don't have to have a person do every task. And so I think, the COVID-19 situation has highlighted a lot of the benefits that autonomous solutions can bring to us that, maybe some people hadn't recognized before. I'll mention one other thing. You asked about technology barriers, and this is something that we deal with every day down in the weeds of actually building new autonomous systems. I think one of the biggest barriers we have right now is this idea of autonomy, or of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the issues with what we call explainable AI. So explainable AI is this idea that when we develop machine learning systems that underlie our autonomous vehicles, so think like a camera that recognizes something as a plastic bag rather than a person or another car. These are machine learning algorithms. Well, the truth is, we don't really have any guarantees of performance with these systems. So a lot of our regular control systems, like our aircraft autopilots or our cruise controllers in our cars, these have provable mathematical performance behind them, and that's why they're so reliable and so trusted. The problem as we get into these like computer vision types of techniques is that we don't have any guarantees anymore about how they'll perform. They'll work 98% of the time, but then 1%, they'll get something wrong and nobody quite knows why. It's a technical barrier that a lot of people are working on, but I see it as being increasingly important to make sure we solve those problems with extremely high reliability.
So John, thanks a lot. So I want to keep building on this, and I'm going to be turning to Jesse now from Airbus. We heard from Lee, we heard from John, definitely, I'll say, integrated thought processes there, Jesse. But a question for you, a little bit broader, obviously coming off of necessarily vehicles. I know John started to go a little bit more into just generally speaking autonomy. What are you seeing, Jesse, as some of the key issues facing the commercial drone and urban air mobility market today?
Thanks for that. So at Airbus, I mean, we've got a lot of activities underway, both with small unmanned systems, high altitude unmanned systems, urban air mobility, people transportation. And one of the biggest things, I mean, we hear a lot about the technologies, and those are absolutely certifiability and reliability important. Major factor that we've seen is really on the regulatory side, both in the United and around the world. In the United States, it's still challenge over on a field in North Dakota. It can take months to get those sorts of approvals. So the regulatory landscape has still been pretty complex. Now, I'll say one positive: if you look over the last couple of months through the COVID situation, we've seen small UAS, for example, delivery firms able to get much more rapid approvals to do things like delivering test kits or ferrying samples back and forth.
Jesse, we're losing you a little bit. Jesse? Hey guys, look, we got like I said, a smallish group, which is great, a little bit manageable for us. We're going to go ahead and put Jesse on hold for a second. I'm going to go ahead and kind of come back to, if you don't mind, come back to Jesse, and we'll get that straightened out with him. But what I want to do now is kind of switch it a little bit and go to Dan Plonk from Northern Southern. And Dan, love to hear your thoughts. When you think about autonomy, we think almost immediately, or at least I'll say the layperson thinks cars, which I think makes sense. You hear more and more about that. And obviously every new car has new and new features, but love to get from you with your thoughts on when do you think, or how do you think the general public will be able to accept a pilotless train or even an airplane at some point?
Right. And I'm actually a pilot as well. Let's see, I'll give you my personal opinion on the airplane there at the end. I think it's going to be, and if you just kind of look at what's going on with the automobiles, we had the setback a couple of years ago where in Arizona, I think it was a autonomous vehicle. Somebody was on board, the vehicle was driving itself and it ran over someone.
Yep, Arizona.
So, yeah, that was Arizona a couple of years ago, and that was a little bit of a setback there. But in our case, I think it may be a little easier. Our vehicles are restrained on our property within the bounds of 2 rails, but we have 10,000 or more. Actually, we have close to 30,000 crossings. Okay, which means those are places, yes. About 10,000 of them are electrified. The other ones just have the signs, and some of them are in a farmer's field. It's gonna take a little while. I think we're gonna have to show in a significant way the research that we've done to be able to get the public on board. We might be 2 out of 5 if the public realizes that, hey, a train sits on rail, it's not on a highway, it can't run amok and get out into the weeds. We might have that advantage. Also, we own all that infrastructure, so we'll be able to put in the sensing and make adjustments to it. A highway, that's a federal or state thing. The rail belongs to us, so we'll be able to do things on the wayside that perhaps would be easier and faster, which would facilitate our progression. It's going to take a while. As was mentioned earlier, you had the AI machine learning comments. I have no doubt we'll get not too or pretty quickly, up to the 95% level, 98% level, where we're detecting a deer and a turkey as opposed to a human. We know the human's walking away from the track or they're stopped. Those kind of things will come pretty quickly. But when you think of all the interactions you have in a day, when you have 500, 600, 700 trains out there running over the course of a day, you're going to find those corner cases, and in some cases, those corner cases are not going to end well, and there will be setbacks as we go along on this thing. We're probably going to have to do a really good job of actually working at least in the public relations side of this thing, so people understand a little bit more about railroads. You can't stop a train on a dime. It doesn't make any difference whether you have 5 people in the cab or none. It's not going to happen. A lot of people might not even realize that, until you're forced to think about it. So it's going to be a fairly long ride. We think it's going to be a 10-year thing before we get to autonomous. There was also some mention earlier about regulatory. The FRA as opposed to the FAA. We're probably a little slower in adopting new things, so that'll be part of it. When you're talking about reducing conductors and engineers, there'll be a pretty significant pushback from labor. We got quite a few pieces we have to address, not to mention the technology side. So it's going to be a little while. And then from the pilot and flying standpoint, I don't have any problem with one pilot being on board and maybe somebody monitoring remotely to help the pilot in case they need it, maybe when they're in the last 2 miles of their trip on approach. It's just tough for me to imagine a plane without anybody in it. So that's my personal opinion there.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan. I sure do appreciate it. I continue to be amazed by the Cirrus aircraft, which has its own parachute. That gives me a lot of solace, whether or not there's a pilot in it or no pilot in it, knowing that there's a parachute if, God forbid, that occurs. Now, just a quick levity for the group. Some of you may have been in another set of comments that I've made around AV, but it just shows you that you don't know everything. And when we were talking about the AV bill a few years ago, a few Southern legislators who are big deer hunters or just overall big hunters, they said, well, how smart is that algorithm that you guys are going to be putting together for these AVs? And I said, well, it's going to be as smart as we can program it to be. They said, well, what happens if a doe runs in front of one of your AVs in October? And of course, I didn't know what to say other than, well, we'll program it to stop. They said, no, you need to program it to stop for 5 seconds because behind that doe is going to be a buck because it's mating season. And I said, well, we're going to have to put into the algorithm that October, November, and December are mating season for deer. So for those of you who are hunters, you'll appreciate that. For those of you who are not, maybe you just learned something today. So I think right there is pretty cool. So let me go ahead. Hopefully we have Jesse back. Jesse, you back?
Yeah, can you guys hear me all right?
Yep, we can hear you great. So I want to go ahead, if it's okay. We kind of lost you towards the end. Love to be able to get that kind of that from you, but also just like Dan just talked about, so my opening comments talked to, John and Lee referred to it around regulatory. Could you maybe give us a sense of where are you seeing air and regulatory, and how are they working together, or frankly, how are they being impediments to us being able to move forward? And ultimately, I want to beat Dallas and LA. I want Georgia to be the first install of air taxis in our country. So maybe even give us a glimpse of what it would take from our state in order to make that possible.
Well, we actually tried as a state. The state of Georgia applied for a program that the FAA put together, which is the primary regulatory body for aviation. It was called the IPP program. It was essentially a pilot program for new technologies and small unmanned systems, even larger unmanned systems. Ultimately, Georgia wasn't selected as one of the locations, but I don't know if you caught it before. I was talking about one of the locations that was selected was North Carolina, for example, and they're starting to see some more rapid approvals in small commercial drone deliveries for things like vaccines or testing kits, especially now during COVID. So that's been one of the benefits. I think the FAA is looking at how can you create more standardized regulations for some of these tools so you don't have to continue going through all the one-off approvals that exist today. So I alluded to before how long it's taken, sometimes 6 months to get approval to fly a small 5-pound drone over a power line in the middle of nowhere. That you can't really scale an industry like that. So a lot of companies are going to other countries to operate. So for example, there's a drone delivery company in the US called Zipline that's been operating in Africa, delivering vaccine supplies for years, and has been very successful in doing so, just now coming to the United States, trying to operate. So I would say I'm hopeful that the regulatory landscape is changing a bit. We're seeing more support for autonomy, not just in small unmanned systems, but even larger people carrying like urban air mobility aircraft, and all the way up to the full-size aircraft like an Airbus aircraft. You can look and see some interesting videos we've got out there on automatic takeoff systems, or even full-scale aircraft that can really help pilots manage the cockpit environment.
Thanks, Jesse. One of the things coming out of COVID, and I don't know if any of the panelists want to comment on this, but if there's one thing we did learn out of COVID, amongst other things, we don't want another virus, but government can move when there's urgency. It reminds me, maybe if you go all the way back to World War II, using President Eisenhower again, and how many tanks and boats we created literally in a 24-month period to be able to do what we needed to do after entering the war in 1941. We saw recently, obviously, the FDA streamline the approval process on things that take normally years, literally taking weeks, if not literally a month or a month and a half. So I'm not suggesting I want another pandemic in order to cause an urgency around air taxis and Airbus and its ability to be able to go autonomous. But I hope, if anything, government at the federal level and the state level have learned, and even the local level, what can we do to just take out, I'll say, bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy? And that leads me to a question for John. John, how do you think, as you're sitting back and you're at Georgia Tech and you have the benefit of being in an academic environment, yet also having that application, which is a great combination for the panel to hear, for the audience to hear, how do you see the balance between autonomy and, I'll say, the human factor? Can you maybe give us a glimpse of that?
Yeah, Todd, great question. And again, we have a lot of experience. We build drones in my lab and design drones for all kinds of different mission sets. But one of the things to keep in mind regarding, your discussion about government and regulation, we don't really know how to certify autonomous systems right now. There's no certification process in place. And in a society where there's a huge trust gap in autonomous systems, that can now be more important. One of the things that will help to close that trust gap is confidence that the regulators are keeping an eye out. The best example, and I hate to point this out, is a 737 MAX, right? And that undermined trust that had been developed over many, many decades. The FAA moves very slowly, partly for a reason. And in the case of the MAX, we saw an example where regulators did not do their job. So one of the biggest challenges we have in the autonomous system space is that if someone develops an autonomous car or an air taxi, how do we certify its performance? A lot of the certification that goes into manned aircraft does not apply. For instance, pilots have certain benchmarks they have to hit. There's a whole pilot training scheme and pilots have to perform the following maneuvers under a FAA designated examiner observes them doing the following maneuvers. Well, we have nothing like that ready for air taxis or drones. And so even coming up with these benchmarks and these certification processes are something that actually needs to be developed before we can start to close that trust gap on the part of the public.
So Lee, so thank you, John. So Lee, building on what John just talked about, absolutely, John, I think you're talking about, I'll just say natural impediments. We're also talking about human factors. And I don't know how many of my constituents who are in the, I'll say the later stages of baby boomers and the older Gen Xs, when we talk about autonomy, immediately they think you're taking my independence away. And many of them are like, hey, I finally have the ability and the wherewithal to buy a sports car. I want to buy it and drive it up in the mountains and really enjoy myself. But when we look, Lee, at so many of the different human factors that go into autonomy, may it be on the road, may it be on rail, etc., I think one of the things we need to be looking at is private enterprise and really getting a better understanding in terms of how our companies, may they be public or private like Cox, how are they investing in AV? Because I think that type of investment starts to show confidence out to, I'll just say, the general public, and hopefully be able to continuously build very slowly, but surely in terms of getting that confidence in terms of embracing AV. So maybe Lee, could you give us a thought on that?
Sure, and I'll answer in two parts. I did want to touch on just what we see play out in the consumer marketplace about confidence around the consumer and the autonomous vehicle. We do a lot of research and we spend a lot of time understanding consumer behaviors and perceptions. And, we've seen some interesting movement in the AV in terms of adoption with the consumer. And, while awareness is rising, acceptance we're seeing has actually declined for the AV over the last few years. And one study that KBB did indicated that 84% of consumers actually still want the option to drive themselves, even if a self-driving vehicle was available, versus 16% that would feel comfortable letting an AV drive without the option of taking control. So I think that's a real indicator of the work to be done to educate the public about safety and benefits of the AV, just for context setting. And then to your part of the question about, well, what is Cox doing today to set up to support the autonomous vehicle? A whole lot. Part of what Cox Mobility believes in, which is the newest division of Cox, we were founded 2 years ago, and I've been there since the early days. We believe in this ACE's future of transportation, right? So autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. The belief also is that the autonomous vehicles of tomorrow will be electric, and those two technologies really will work hand in hand. So as we think about equipping these to safely, pass over our service roads and highways and freeways, one of the new services and needs to maintain these vehicles in terms of uptime and safety is to understand how those sensors are functioning independently, but also together to perceive the world around that vehicle. And that sensor fusion is here, right? And it all started really in 2014 when NHTSA declared that by 2018, every vehicle manufacturer had to have a backup camera. So what we're setting up at our locations, our mobility hubs, and our Pivot Atlanta Mobility Hub is the first in the nation to do this, is to establish capabilities to diagnose those sensors that support the advanced driver assist systems on cars, which is really the precursor to AV, right? And then as a result of those diagnostics, understand if certain sensors like a windshield camera or radar need to be calibrated to ensure that they're perceiving the world around them the right way. And why that's important to Cox and our clients and really the whole transportation industry is as vehicles get serviced and repaired or just even inspected, it's important to understand that component of that vehicle as a part of that vehicle story and safety profile. So we're working hard through investments to understand vehicle alignment kind of as that first step, but then be able to diagnose and ultimately calibrate those sensors on any fleet vehicle or other vehicle we touch so that we can make sure that they go off to do their round or to support a consumer in their day-to-day driving, and we know that they're safe.
Great, thanks, Lee. And just a shameless plug, wasn't asked to do it for Lee, but I'm going to do it anyways. I've been down to the Cox facility near the airport with your combination with Lyft and with Georgia Power, and the things that you're doing with an electric fleet and the things that you're doing with Lyft are just phenomenal. And I think that is the precursor to getting us to AV. So shameless plug, and no, I wasn't asked to do it. But at the end of the day, thank you so much for doing that. And we sure do appreciate Cox making that investment, because I think more and more private investment doing that will get us into the AV that we'd like. Hey, we have a question coming off from the audience right now, so I want to go ahead and put the panelists on the spot. John, the question's actually to you, and I'd love to hear if any of the other panelists have any opinion, but here it comes. You may see it in the chat box, actually, but here we go. John mentioned developing drones at Georgia Tech. What applications are they using the drones for? Are they able to operate them pretty freely on campus, or do they have restrictions there? So tell us what the jacket they're doing.
Yes, so in our lab, we develop drones for a lot of different things. Some of them are developed for military applications to land on moving vehicles, which are also important for package delivery. So like a UPS truck driving down the highway, and then drones taking off and bringing a package out, the last mile, and then coming back and recovering. So just that process of having a drone self-recover to a moving vehicle. So we're working on that. We're also working on drones collaboratively picking up packages, and even the problem of drones capturing other drones. If we have people operating in areas, small, little DJI Phantom type drones, how do we disable them if they're operating near Hartsfield? So those are problems that we work on as well. Now, regarding the restrictions, yes, we have a lot of restrictions. We are a government entity, so our path to getting what they call a certificate of authorization to operate drones is a lot smoother than, for instance, Jesse's would be. So it's nice to work at a state school. But that being said, we have to get, particularly for our larger drones, anything over about 50 pounds or so has to go through an authorization process from the FAA. We don't operate on campus outside of very specific parameters, but one thing we do have is an indoor flight facility where we do a lot of our testing, and then we have no regulation. So we have a giant high bay space where we fly inside, and that really facilitates development.
That's awesome. I will tell you, one of the cool things that I've been seeing is about a year ago, I don't know if you know this, Florida Power and Light literally transformed a massive recreational vehicle into an airport control tower with drone operations that are basically there down in Florida to go through and literally inspect the lines. And they're now also using it for their nuclear reactors. So things that used to take, literally days of human capital are now taking hours. And they do that obviously in conjunction with the FAA and others. But I think you're right. There's so many different places for that application. Jesse, I want to put you on the spot a little bit, because we just talked a little bit about drones, and give us a sense, Lee has talked about it, Dan has talked about it, in terms of what COVID did and what investments look like. Give me a sense, or give the panel and the audience a sense of how has COVID impacted Airbus, and has it impacted at all from a drone perspective, from your strategy, capital investment, et cetera?
Well, I have to talk about what it's done to the market separately from Airbus. I mean, I think it's definitely a challenging time for Airbus when it comes to the investments we make. I mean, it's one of the biggest crises, I would say, Airbus and Boeing and the entire aviation industry have ever seen. So they're having to be very cognizant of where they put additional investment dollars. So I'll say we're definitely challenged there. But as far as where we're seeing improvements in the market, the more I talk to companies that are implementing these technologies, we're seeing more acceptance. For example, using drones as a way for fewer people to have to be out in the field. So for example, some of the work we do is in the insurance industry, using both drones and satellites for remote inspection of buildings or homes after storms. Today, they send roofers, they send insurance adjusters out. Now insurance adjusters can leverage services where they'll look at a satellite image, a drone image of a property, and not have to actually go out, interact with the homeowner. So it's better for the homeowner, it's better for the insurance company, it speeds the claims process. This was a pretty challenging thing to do from an acceptance standpoint and a regulatory standpoint 6 months ago. Now we're seeing huge widespread adoption where companies are much more opting for that sort of remote work, remote services that they can use some of these technologies for. So we're seeing it in inspections. We're seeing it in the agricultural market for things like looking at crop health and yields. And in general, we're also seeing an uptick in some of our higher altitude unmanned system program, both from a government standpoint and a commercial standpoint for things like tracking wildfires and things like that, where, again, today you'd have a lot of folks out in the field working together to do that. Now they can get this information stream and do it remotely.
Great. Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate it. Dan, we're going to be coming to you on middle miles now. When most people hear middle miles and AV, they immediately think of, the 18-wheeler picking up from the Port of Savannah with a driver, the truck being brought to I-16, and then I'll just say goes driverless all the way to Birmingham. And then once it needs to hit the surface streets of Birmingham, a driver hits in. So could you maybe give us a sense when, as Northern Suffolk, are you looking at middle miles? Is that even something that applies to train operations, or is there a different way that you're going to be seeing AV as it applies to train operations?
No, so your let's see, middle miles might be the train trips from Savannah to Chicago, and then you have the first and last mile. Is that how you refer to middle miles?
Yep.
Yes, actually, and this one neat thing about railroads, our biggest competitor is trucking, so we tend to collaborate very closely, and we actually work through an organization called the AAR, the American Association of Railroads. And there's already a significant effort in actually going into developing the locomotive control systems and getting those better integrated, and actually also doing the very initial research into the sensing that would be required to replace the 2020 vision of humans. So as you stated, from a train perspective, that's where we'll start with, we have two-person crews now, conductor and engineer. I think everybody's familiar with that. With positive train control, which we've been working on over the last 10 years and will be done by the end of this year, we'll probably be able to go to one-person crews because the locomotive knows where it is, and if the engineer doesn't act, the train will act and stop or slow down. That's where our focus will be in the middle miles, the long runs of trains, and developing the machine vision and control systems that would be necessary for actually implementing that. One thing, and this is where truckers have an advantage over us, they get rid of their vehicles every 5 to 7 years based on mileage. So they're turning technology over. We keep locomotives 25 to 40 years. So going back and putting this recent technology on a 25-year-old locomotive is very painful for us. So that's a challenge that we face. We don't turn our equipment over like truckers do. That's an advantage that they have. But from autonomy standpoint, the long haul, middle miles, that is our focus currently, and we see that perhaps reaching fruition in the early 2030s.
Early 2030s. Great. Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
Lee, a little bit on the spot. Georgia changed its leasing laws 3 years ago, and we've seen an uptick in leasing. So to Dan's point, a little more technology, I think, turnover. What is Cox's opinion on, have you seen more of that turnover within, I'll say, the fleets and the personal ownership and leasing of Georgians?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the financial vehicle that you use to satisfy mobility is going to change turnover. And, we monitor leasing closely, and certainly that's a benefit to a lot of what Cox does, because many of those off-lease vehicles come back to our wholesale auctions, Mannheim. So yes, it's an impact. Also, I'd add to that is the introduction of subscription, right? So the belief, big picture, is that consumers are looking for more sort of economically viable ways to satisfy mobility in general, and forking over a whole bunch of money for a down payment or just a long-term lease doesn't make sense, right? They want more flexibility with their dollars, so they're more willing to enter into subscription. And getting back to the introduction of technology and all that is, so you have these highly utilized assets in what's either more of a fleet model where it's subscription, or a lease model where the consumer might drive it a few years and then hand it over. But certainly in the fleet model, those highly utilized assets are turned over more quickly because they're racking up more miles. So with that then comes the introduction of, turning over your fleet and the potential to sort of upgrade those technologies and have a more sophisticated set of sensors and whatnot. And then in the background, somewhat related, right, we're watching how the government is providing incentives as part of the SAFE Act, right, to incent the adoption of new vehicles, and the expectation is those new vehicles will also have better safety features like ADAS as well.
Yep, thanks. I appreciate that. And I'm either guilty of what you just said, or I'm part of that trend. When Fisker last year came out and said you can throw a deposit down for the subscription starting in 2022, I did it. So I'm waiting on my Fisker SUV, and it will be a subscription for the exact reasons you said. I just want to always have the most recent technology, and hopefully I'll be able to get that out of a subscription. So thanks. Hey everyone, we got a question that I don't know if it is AV related or not. I don't want to necessarily prime it that way, but pretty cool question about something that's happening in Chicago. So for those of you who don't know, Elon Musk Boring Company is boring a tunnel between the Loop and O'Hare. Pretty interesting. And I know I have a little bit of an opinion, but love to hear the panel's thoughts. The question is, do you think tunnels like Tesla's boring will come to Georgia? Anyone have an opinion? There's a 3-second time limit on all panelists. No. All right. Let me give you mine if you don't mind. I'm super excited to see, if you've ever been on the Blue Line, which is the rail system between the Inner Loop and O'Hare, it takes about 45 to 50 minutes, but it's definitely better than getting on, I believe they actually call it the Eisenhower, between the Inner Loop and O'Hare, because that could take sometimes an hour and a half to 2 hours. So think of the connector here in Atlanta and MARTA from, say, North Springs all the way to Hartsfield, very similar. I think there's an opportunity for Georgia. I think specifically in Atlanta, at least for right now, in Metro Atlanta. The question for me will be, can we, to Jesse's point, and also to some extent to Dan's point, can we affect regulation and regulatory environments in the air fast enough to make it where we can move people just as efficiently and faster, and I'll say existing lanes, meaning the air lanes, as opposed to boring a tunnel underneath Metro Atlanta? It'd be a pretty interesting conversation to have. Maybe we can get Georgia Tech to host that, because that would probably take 2 or 3 hours of academics going back and forth in terms of cost benefit and pro and con. But I think it's something we should be looking at. But at the same time, I don't want to forego the opportunity to think that we do have the air lanes up top, and what can we do to maximize those before, again, we start boring or even creating additional lanes in terms of construction. So thanks a lot for that question, Steve. I sure do appreciate it. Hey, everyone, we've come to the end of the questions, and I sure do appreciate everyone's time. I'm going to be giving each one of the panelists an opportunity for any type of final comments before we wrap this up. Let me go ahead and tell Dennis, I will make sure I get a hold of you regarding air taxis, and then also to James, I'll make sure I get a hold of you regarding AI and machine learning, regarding some of the questions that you have there. But ultimately, thank everyone. And I want to go ahead and go in my video. I see Jesse is all the way to my right. So I want to start with Jesse, then go to John, then go to Dan, and then go to Lee for any final comments that you might have. So Jesse, you have any final comments for everybody?
I just want to say thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Great to be part of this group with TAG. I'm very hopeful for what drones and particularly what urban air mobility can do for a lot of cities. And I think it's going to be a huge industry here for Georgia. I know as a Georgia Tech alumni myself, and I'm also very excited to see all of the research that's going on, not just at Georgia Tech, but with a lot of the companies around town. So I see a huge opportunity for a lot of these technologies to really expand, not just on the air, but also on the ground here in Georgia.
All right, thanks, Jesse. John?
Yeah, again, I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to be part of this today. You know, at Georgia Tech, it's something that we are very focused on, is this idea of, you know, autonomy, ground, autonomous vehicles, and then, aerial vehicles as well. In fact, last year we launched the Center for Urban and Regional Air Mobility, which is a group of professors from various disciplines that are looking at this problem and all of the issues that arise from it, whether it's technological, regulatory, and even psychological, as many of us have talked about. So it's definitely a fascinating area. I think, it's worthy of the attention of some of the smartest people, both in academia as well as business. So thanks again.
And thank you, John. And under the guise of the enemy, my enemy is my friend, as a double gator, I definitely align with the Yellow Jackets for obvious reasons.
Well, thank you.
Dan, any closing comments?
Well, I'm actually a University of Florida and a Georgia Tech grad. So let's see, what am I, jumping or riding the fence there in that area. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great to hear the other modes in here. One thing I will say about the railroads, and this is very interesting because we own all of, if you think of these giant bridges over the Mississippi, we own all those. Giant bridges over the Missouri, over the Ohio. We own all of that infrastructure. So that's not a federal thing like a highway is. So there's so much more than an autonomous vehicle for us to apply autonomy to. Even projects that allow people to focus on the more important things, projects that save millions of dollars with a couple $100,000 investment. That's the area that I work in, all the way from small to large, because there's so much stuff out there that's to do. And that's what kind of brought me to the railroad when I was 30 years old. I realized that there was an awful lot to running the railroad that you just didn't know until you came in for an interview. Sometimes I'm surprised that I was actually hired because I knew so little about the railroad. Just putting in a plug for the fact that we're looking at all the way from automating processes using a TIBCO complex event processor, getting weather inputs. We've already done that. Connecting, if you think of our railroad, it's all at the edge. We're super edge. The switches, the signals, the tracks, the track circuits, the comm towers, you name it. We're now actually working on knowing the state of all of that and giving it to the assigned supervisor. We're taking 50s technology like slide fences and actually using sensors, LiDAR, optical, infrared to do that stuff. We actually have a movement planner that plans the train routes and actually executes those. The nifty thing there, you get ETAs at the next crew change location where you can order the crews on duty automatically using the TIBCO machine. So that's one beautiful thing about a railroad. If you have children that are technically inclined, work well with people, it's a great place to come to work because there's so much good stuff to do. There's so many moving parts. We own all the infrastructure. Just a great place to be in to do autonomy because it spans the spectrum from small to large. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Lee?
Thank you. It's been a privilege to be here today and great to get to know this panel. I close by saying, obviously Cox is passionate about supporting the transportation future, and we know that future is going to look a whole lot different than it does today. We believe in a large part the consumer is in the driving seat, and that consumer is motivated by economics, right? They're looking for the most equitable way to get around, and in that example, AV could be a real asset, right? Because when you take the driver out of the vehicle, those economics sure do look a heck of a lot better. But in the midterm, addressing all of these psychological barriers associated with getting an autonomous vehicle from a consumer perspective, addressing safety, building out infrastructure, whether it's charging infrastructure for vehicles on the road or air traffic management, for drones or UAM. I think, there are some technological and regulatory things that need to come to pass to really, ignite this marketplace, but we believe it's coming.
Thanks, Lee. I sure do appreciate that. I have 3 closing comments for everyone. First and foremost, a huge thank you to TAG, the Transportation Subcommittee, and also to all the panelists. Sure to appreciate it. This has been great banter going along for about 50 minutes. And I would encourage everyone, if you have any questions or any follow-up, I'm sure Todd can help you get a hold of the panelists or with me. And if there's any type of follow-up that we can do, happy to do so. Second, just to get philosophical on the last two, and I promise to make it short. One, whether or not you believe it's an economic driver, meaning autonomy, and that economic driver can mean bringing 3 to 5% of our population back into the economy. And what I mean by that is what Lee was talking about. When you think about the mobility issues that our senior citizens have, physically disabled folks have, and we think about economically, when we are able to drive the costs down because of autonomy, what does that mean with getting 3 to 5% of our population back into the economy? So if you're just someone driven by numbers, you know what? Right there is a rational reason to push autonomy as much as you can. If you are moved by transportation, for those of us, for instance, I live in Forsyth County, the only way I can get to the airport is if I leave at 0:30 or if I leave at noon. Those are really my only two options. Coming out of the airport is I land by 2 or I land at 7 or later. And it'd be great to be able to be in a world where I don't have to necessarily look at maps to determine how it is that I come and go in and out of Metro Atlanta. But then ultimately, I think we need to be thinking about, if you look from 1945 to 2020, so we're talking a 75-year span, there's an argument to be made that no other, I'll just say civilization, has ever achieved economic expansion like we did in those 75 years. And I think we can also agree, or hopefully agree, that innovation was one of the top 3 drivers that made that possible from 1945 to 2020. I think that autonomy, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, the move into the 4th industrial revolution, I think today, unlike in 45, we have a lot of global competitors that could possibly be the tip of the spear for the next 75 years. And I think it is an imperative for us to take that lead. I think we can take that lead, which then leads to my last ask. In this day and age, and it's hard to believe coming from an elected official, I hope we can keep politics out of it. I'm not going to get into politics, it's not appropriate, but I hope we can just keep great policy and support these folks that are on the round table right now and all of their efforts, support the companies that are backing them, because I think from, I'll just say, a nonpartisan point of view, our ability to be that innovative company, our country, to be the region, and hopefully the Southeast becomes the headquarters of autonomy. I do not want the Silicon Valley to beat us to that. And if we can do that and truly be the tip of the spear, we are able to achieve something that no one has ever been able to achieve in Georgia, and that's this: uncoupling us from the federal economy. And I know that sounds like a crazy goal, but I don't want to have our economy dip when the federal economy does, and I don't want us necessarily to be tied to them in terms of when all boats rise with a rising tide. If we put ourselves in a position to lead in the 4th industrial revolution instead of follow, I think we put ourselves in a truly competitive advantage. And that barrier to entry will be something that I think will hold us for decades to come. I want to thank everybody for their time. I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak with each of you. And I thank each of you, and I hope you each have a great day. Thank you so much, and goodbye on behalf of the panel. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.